Son of man, look to the sky, lift your spirit, set it free. So I read A Natural History of Dragons, a memoir by Lady Trent by Marie Brennan, which as long as I've been aware of this book, I've sort of respected the double author, like the author of the fictional book. I've always sort of dug that. And the title of this book was very interesting to me, A Natural History of Dragons, you say? This book is the story of a woman who started as a little girl with a great interest in discovering the science behind dragons, because this takes place in a technically high fantasy world, because it is a world completely unlike our own, though very similar to our own in certain ways. But the main difference being that dragons are real. They're not like super common, but they exist in our world similar to something like bears. And Isabella, the main character of this story, just wants to grow up and study dragons. But the story takes place in a historical context where it's not okay for women to be scientists, to have like intellectual stimulating conversation and studies. So while Isabella has this drive and desire to study this field of science, she's pushing against a lot of societal pressures and people in her life who want her to follow the traditional feminine roles that have been laid out for her. But Isabella says, no, I'm going to do what I want to do because I'm very passionate about it and I have this drive and knowledge and ability to be able to do this, and she pushes against it the whole time. So as I said, while this is a fantasy story, there are dragons, the places are not real. It very much mimics a lot of things that we can see in Western history. And something I would like to explain right off the bat is that while this book is fantasy and technically there are dragons in it, this is not at all what you might expect from a traditional fantasy novel. And I would like to take this moment to just appreciate how diverse in theming and like tone fantasy can be. I just finished binging the Cradle series. I'm a huge fan of the Cosmere, and this technically exists within the same big genre as those series, and it could not be more different. And that change of pace is nice. Now, this might be seen as a very mild spoiler, but this book, while it is fantasy, is actually sort of just a historical fiction book in a lot of ways. Because while there are dragons, there's not magic to speak of in this first book. It is very much just like a normal, regular book about a person in a society trying to study the science of this fantastical creature. And that's a weird and interesting combo. But rather than being something that you might traditionally think of when you are watching videos on this channel or listening to the books that I normally talk about, this one is so different because it doesn't have any magical element. It's like historical fiction. And I think the best way to sort of explain it is it's like part Indiana Jones, part Jane Austen, and part like Tarzan. Hence my intro song. Because like in Tarzan, Jane goes to the jungle to study gorillas. This one's about Isabella going on an adventure to study a specific type of dragon. And you have the Jane Austen element where there's a lot of clever dialogue and pretty writing and really cool societal commentary. But it's an adventure with a fun mythological creature like something like Indiana Jones. I think that's the best way to sort of explain this. All that to say, it is a very mundane story in the literal sense. But what the story lacks in traditional draws for regular readers, I think it makes up for in prose and an execution of this story. But I do think it's worth mentioning to potential readers that this is very much closer to historical fiction, historical fantasy, than it is like other subgenres of fantasy. And I enjoyed it. It was a jarring shock to read this after reading some of the other recent reads I've had recently, but it was definitely interesting. And as the plot starts to unfold, I like some of the directions that it took while not loving other directions that it took. But the way that it ends, I think, is a promising tease for what might be to come in the series as far as the direction of the character growth, the type of story you might see in book 2. But the struggle that I personally had with it was that historical fiction, historical fantasy isn't necessarily my jam all the time. While I definitely enjoyed the actual writing of Marie Brennan and the character of Lady Trent, the plot itself wasn't that gripping for me, though I was interested in the character interactions and continued to be interested for when I pick up the second book. Because my tastes tend to lean toward the fantastical, the magical, the mystery. There was a bit of a mystery here, but because because of the nature of the story and it not being what I was expecting or what I typically enjoy, I had to lean on some of the other elements of the book for my own interests, namely the writing and some of the character work. That being said, there were pieces of the story that I thought were really interesting that were teased and sort of got glossed over. The story starts with Isabella as a child, and we get to see some of her beginning interest in dragons arise, but there are periods, because we want to get to the story of her as an adult, where we skip over chunks that I wish we sort of had got to explore. It might have added a lot of length to the book in ways that, like, the target demographic for this book might not necessarily have cared for as much. And the story set me up for a really interesting deep dive into just the science of dragons, and we do get pieces of that here and there, but the B plot of this first book was leaning on a little bit more of the Indiana Jones adventure element in a way that didn't hook me exactly, which is fine because the book isn't that long. It's not like you're reading this huge, taxing, epic tome. You're reading a relatively short story with the audiobook coming in, I think, around 10 hours. So if you're interested at all, it's not like it's a huge commitment to read the series, which is why if what I'm saying right now about the caveats for what's going on in the book don't turn you off, you should definitely check it out. But I would definitely dissuade someone who's looking for a more traditional fantasy like I might talk about here on the channel. It may not be for you if the things that I've said here are weird or you don't think they'll work for you. They may not. But for people that enjoy really good prose or clever writing, that's definitely probably the biggest draw, I would say, for the series. And if I were to be interested in continuing along with the series after reading book 2, I do want to see more actual dragon science become more of like a central plot theme. And now that the character has actually been established, I would hope that by book 2, we are able to focus more on specific relationships and character growth now that we don't have to give as much of the backstory in getting the pieces into place, if that makes any sense. That all boils down to, did I love it? No. Did I like it? Yes, but I like it in a way that I could definitely be convinced by further books in the series to love it eventually, especially now that I know more of what it actually is instead of bringing my own preconceived notions into the series, which can always affect you when you're reading something or experiencing anything. That being said, for me, this book can be a weird one to recommend because if you don't like fantasy, there's enough fantasy that it might be tough, but if you do like fantasy and your normal draws for fantasy are elements that are very present in the other books that I typically talk about, this one doesn't have those elements. It's very much aiming to be a different thing. I think this is more likely to be a book that fans of Jane Austen like than fans of the Cosmere, for instance. But if you're looking to try something extremely different or any of the elements I mentioned before sound really interesting, check it out. I know a lot of people that love this one. Thank you so much to my friend Michaela for sending this one to me. Your passion for this series brings me energy and joy, even if the book itself wasn't my favorite, at least this first one. Thanks to all of my friends in the Discord who took the time to chat this one out with me a little bit. The Discord is linked down below. Anybody can join. If you read this book, what did you think? Based on what I said here, does this book sound really interesting to you, or does it not sound like your type of thing? I hope to see you again soon in a future video. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.
Sleep, no one ever get enough. Always looking out tired. Sleep, no one ever get enough. If I don't show up, I might get fired. Sleep, no one ever get enough. Always looking out tired. Sleep, no one ever get enough. If I don't show up, I might get fired.